Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're really undertaking quite an ambitious mission, I think.
Definitely.
We want to cut straight through that sort of classical facade, the marble temples, the grand law code.
Yeah, the stuff everyone pictures.
Exactly. And get to how the legal systems of ancient Greece and Rome actually operated, as well as raw, high-stakes mechanisms of power.
We're asking the tough questions. How is law used not just for, say, sorting out disputes,
Right.
but really to enforce social control, to wage political battles, and maybe most fundamentally, to define who you actually were in that society?
And the sources we've gathered for this deep dive are, well, they're incredibly revealing, aren't they?
They really are. They give us this amazing window into two societies that were, let's be honest, highly stratified, often quite brutal.
You see it immediately. Legal rights, the kinds of punishments you faced. It was all completely tied up with your social standing. There was no pretending otherwise.
No, none at all. And that's the core tension we really want to explore today, isn't it? This constant push and pull between the state trying to regulate what individuals did, while at the same time actually formalizing and, locking in these really deep social inequalities.
So we're going to see the Athenians, for instance, turning their courts into something like political theater. We'll look at the crushing weight of vengeance, how legal terms could be stretched, almost weaponized.
Yeah, weaponized is the right word.
Against opponents. And then we pivot completely. We go to the Roman Empire.
A whole different scale.
Right, and analyze this explicit dual penalty system. Inequality, written right into the law, but also some genuinely astonishing bits of legal ingenuity designed to handle the sheer complexity of a massive empire's commerce.
It's a fantastic contrast. You've got Athenian law, which feels very personal, often driven by conflict and honor, almost face-to-face, versus Roman law, which becomes incredibly formal, systematic, focused on imperial standards. It's quite a journey. Let's dive in.
Okay, let's start in Athens then. When you look at Athenian justice, especially around violence, homicide, you quickly realize the state isn't quite the prime mover you might expect.
That's a really crucial distinction to make right off the bat. The state was more like a manager. It was managing private retribution.
Not initiating it.
And not primarily, no. The deepest roots of Athenian law here are tangled up with ideas of miasma religious pollution and this absolute necessity to cleanse that pollution, often through revenge.
Right.
And you see this tension between the private drive for vengeance and the public administration of justice, clearest in homicide law. One of the most powerful, almost chilling concepts is the iptisk vitin, the dying injunction.
We sometimes gloss over that, maybe see it in tragedies, but this is a real formal legal act, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It wasn't just drama. The victim, as they were dying, or if not their closest kin right after, would formally lay this command, this legal and social mandate, on the survivors.
A command to do what?
To seek retribution, to prosecute the killer. And this wasn't just a suggestion, if you get around to it. It was a profound duty.
What happened is they didn't.
To ignore the iptisk vitin. Well, that was inviting that same miasma, that pollution, onto yourself, your family, your household. You risked becoming a social outcast. It could even affect your property rights, your standing in the community. It really forced the family's hand.
So the state wasn't taking the burden off the family.
Not at all. It was basically saying, okay, you have this duty. Here's a regulated civic way you can fulfill it. It channels the vengeance. It doesn't replace it.
But even within that system, the family, the kin seeking justice, they had options, right? It wasn't just one path.
Correct. And these options offered different tactical advantages. You could go the traditional route, the really old one, rooted in kin obligations, the dikaiphonu. That fell under Draco's ancient laws.
Draco, 7th century BC, very old laws.
Very old. Very specific rules about who could bring the case, which relatives, and how. Or you could opt for a more public process.
This was.
It was called apagoge. It roughly translates to leading away or maybe summary arrest.
Summary arrest. That sounds quite different.
It was. Fundamentally, apagoge was designed for dealing with obvious criminals caught red-handed. Kakorgoi, malefactors think thieves, temple robbers, guys snatching cloaks in the agora.
Okay, petty criminals caught in the act. How does that apply to homicide?
Well, that's where it gets interesting. Through custom and maybe some clever legal maneuvering, people found ways to use this apagoge process even for homicide cases.
So if the traditional kin-based route, the dikaiphonu, was maybe procedurally tricky, if you couldn't find the right relatives or prove the lineage exactly, Why wouldn't you just use apogoge? Seems simpler.
But this is where we see the strategic thinking of Athenian litigants. It wasn't always about simple. We have this fantastic piece of evidence, a speech from a triarch.
A naval commander, so a man of some standing.
It's definitely. High-status citizen. And he's prosecuting the killers of a freed woman. In his court speech, he spends a lot of time talking about how difficult the dikaifono is, the complex kin requirements, the procedural hurdles he's facing. He paints this picture of himself battling the system.
Okay.
But here's the fascinating bit, what he doesn't talk about. He completely ignores, suppresses the fact that apogoge might have been an option for this homicide case. He doesn't mention it once.
Why? Why hide a potentially easier legal route?
It likely comes down to political theater and moral weight. The triarch and his advisors probably knew that the dikaifono, rooted in Draco's laws, steeped in tradition, carried this immense moral authority. It felt right, ancient, proper.
So by pretending the apogoge wasn't an option,
He could argue to the jury, essentially, look how hard we're fighting. The traditional, proper way is blocked by technicalities. You, the jury, need to step in and grant justice because the system itself is failing us.
wow. So it wasn't about efficiency, it was about the narrative.
Exactly. He leveraged the difficulty of the traditional path for emotional impact. It was a calculated choice between available legal tools, picked for its psychological and political edge, not just procedural ease.
That kind of strategic maneuvering really shows Athenian law wasn't just about fixed rules. It was advocacy, persuasion,
Yeah.
politics, really.
Absolutely. And you see that dynamic crystal clear in how the definition of a kokorgos, that malefactor we mentioned, kept changing.
Right. The guy you could summarily arrest using apogoge, it started simple.
Very simple. Kokorgos originally meant a basic, low-level criminal, someone doing wicked deeds. The kind of offenses were immediate, obvious things, common theft, maybe mugging someone for their cloak, crimes against public order that you wanted to deal with quickly.
Get him off the street.
Precisely. But then that definition starts to stretch a lot.
House.
The state, or maybe just ambitious prosecutors, found the speed and procedural ease of labeling someone a kokorgos just too tempting to limit to petty thieves. Our sources show that by the mid-4th century BC, say 3 to 465 BC, the definition had ballooned. It now included things like seducers.
Seducers.
Yeah.
That seems like a jump from cloak snatching. More about honor, family.
Exactly. An offense against family integrity and honor. And even more strikingly, it eventually stretched to include killers.
Killers.
Yeah.
Prosecuted under the same summary procedure as a thief.
Potentially, yes. This fundamentally changed the category. It went from being a simple tool for managing street crime to this flexible, really powerful weapon that political opponents could wield against each other.
And we know people objected to this, that this expansion wasn't just accepted.
We absolutely do. We have the arguments of a man named Euxithius. He was facing a serious charge, prosecuted under this kokorgos procedure.
And what did he say?
He stood up in court and argued forcefully, basically saying, hang on, using this category for something as serious as homicide, this is totally unprecedented. This isn't what this law was for.
He called him out on stretching the definition.
He did. His defense makes it clear. Prosecutors were deliberately choosing the kokorgos route to bypass the traditional, sometimes slower, more rule-bound homicide courts. They wanted a faster, maybe less restrictive path to conviction.
It's a perfect snapshot of how Athenian law was constantly being molded, redefined by the people using it, often for political advantage.
I couldn't put it better myself.
Speaking of political advantage, and maybe disadvantage, let's talk about the ultimate political reckoning in Athens, the aftermath of the 30 tyrants, that brutal oligarchy, and the amnesty of 403 BC that followed.
Right, the amnesty. A really foundational moment, designed explicitly to stop Athens tearing itself apart in civil war after the oligarchy was overthrown.
It was basically an act of collective forgetting, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Forgive and move on?
It was radical in that sense, yes, a deliberate attempt at institutional forgetting. But it wasn't absolute. There was a loophole, or rather a very specific criterion if you wanted to hold former oligarchs or their collaborators legally accountable for killings during the tyranny.
And that was
The requirement of autochair. It means killing with one's own hand.
with one's own hands. So if you just ordered the execution,
You were protected by the amnesty.
or if you voted for it in their council.
Protected. Served the oligarchy indirectly, drove the cart, guarded the prison. Protected. The liability was incredibly narrow. Only the person who physically committed the killing could be prosecuted under the amnesty's rules for homicide.
That sounds unbelievably cynical. If the aim was stability, Surely letting all the commanders and organizers walk free while only targeting the lowest level executioners would just breed resentment.
It was cynical, deeply so, but also, arguably, politically astute in a grim way. They needed stability above all. Forgiveness was essential. But they also needed some semblance of accountability.
So auto chair was the compromise.
It looks like it.
Yeah.
By setting the bar that high killing with your own hand, they made it almost impossible to prosecute the major figures, the leaders of the 30. Most could just melt back into Athenian life. It was a trade-off. Protect the powerful to stop the killing.
So who could actually be held liable if you interpret autocare that strictly?
Well, under the very strictest reading, maybe only the 11.
The 11, who were they?
They were the officials actually responsible for managing the prison and carrying out executions. The state executioners, effectively.
Okay, so they did the physical act sometimes.
Sometimes. But even their liability was complicated. The sources point out something chilling. If the condemned person was executed by being forced to drink hemlock.
Which was common, like Socrates.
Exactly. That was often considered a self-administered death. The condemned person physically drank it themselves. So under the autocare rule, the 11 might not be liable for homicide even then because they didn't technically kill with their own hand.
That's a loophole within a loophole. So how could they ever be held accountable?
The main legal avenue, it seems, wasn't directly for the killings under the amnesty, but through a different process. The euthanae.
Right, the euthanae. Explain that again. Why did that get around the amnesty?
The euthanae was the mandatory audit, the review of conduct, that every single Athenian official had to go through when they left office. Every single one.
A kind of performance review.
A very serious one. It covered everything: financial mismanagement, abuse of power, general dishonorable conduct in office. Now, the amnesty protected people from charges specifically related to actions during the tyranny connected to the political conflict.
But the euthanae was about their performance as officials.
Exactly. It was about their fundamental duty to the state in their official capacity. So if the 11 failed their euthanae maybe for abuses of power that weren't homicide under the autocure rule, or for corruption, that failure placed them outside the amnesty's specific protection for political acts. It opened them up to charges for misconduct in office.
That's fascinating. The law finds this specific bureaucratic pressure point, the accountability review, that the big political amnesty couldn't quite shield.
It shows the system finding ways, however narrow, to impose some consequences.
Okay, but let's look at someone who definitely did not escape the reckoning. A man named Agorastus.
Agorastus. He's almost the perfect case study in how law becomes a tool for political denunciation, for crafting a public narrative.
What did he do?
During the oligarchy, Agorastus denounced several prominent democratic generals and military commanders, the taxiarchs. He basically informed on them, handed them over to the 30, who then had them executed.
So he actively collaborated.
He did. And the prosecution against him later, famously delivered by the orator Lysias, didn't just say he made a mistake or acted under duress. No, Lysias framed Agorastus' actions as a deliberate, calculated choice to betray Athens and align himself with its murderous enemies.
He became the poster child for betrayal.
Absolutely. The prosecution worked very hard to cement Agorastus in the public mind as the political and moral antithesis of his victims. The victims were portrayed as heroes, honorable Democrats. Agorastus was the traitor.
Was there evidence for this deliberate choice?
Lysias highlighted a key point. Agorastus had actually been arrested himself earlier by the Democrats, but was given a chance to simply leave Attica, go into exile. Instead, he chose to stay and denounce his own friends, the people who had guaranteed his safety.
Oh, wow.
And because of this, the 30 supposedly hailed him as a Euergetes, a benefactor of their regime. That detail made his guilt seem undeniable to the restored democracy. The trial wasn't just about punishing Agorastus.
It was about
defining who was good and who was bad, solidifying this unifying story for the Athenian people about who the true enemies of the democracy were, and reaffirming their own identity after the trauma of the 30.
So, trials as identity formation. This focus on civic identity, on honor, brings us neatly to our last Athenian concept for this section, the law of hubris.
Hubris, a word we still use, but the legal meaning in Athens was very specific and very serious.
I think of it as arrogance, maybe excessive pride.
That's part of it, but legally it was much more concrete. It was a public crime, a graphe. It aimed to regulate conduct that threatened the social order and hierarchy.
How was it different from just, say, punching someone? Simple assault, which they called akia.
Good question. Akia was about the physical harm, the battery. Hubris was about the intent behind the act. It was intentional, often gratuitous violence or, crucially, insult, delivered specifically to humiliate, shame, and diminish the victim publicly.
So it wasn't the injury itself, but the message of disrespect.
Exactly. The core of hubris was the affront to the victim's honor, their time. The law recognized that certain acts, especially things like sexual misconduct, public degradation, maybe spitting on someone or mocking them viciously in public, weren't just personal attacks. They were attacks on the victim's social standing, their status, potentially even their rights as a citizen.
And in a society like Athens, where honor was everything, that kind of public shaming was a direct threat to the polis itself.
Precisely. That's why hubris was a public charge, not just a private suit between individuals. The penalties could be severe, massive fines, loss of citizen rights, even death in extreme cases. Because it was all about the public, intentional nature of the humiliation, prosecuting hubris was itself a public declaration. Quote, "My standing, my honor has been unlawfully attacked, and the state needs to step in and restore the balance."
It was deeply tied into that competitive, agonistic culture of honor we see in Athens.
Absolutely. Protecting honor through law was fundamental to maintaining social order.
Okay, let's shift gears dramatically now. We leave the often chaotic political theater and personal honor battles of Athens,
Yeah, it's quite a change.
and we head to Rome. Massive scale, bureaucratic administration, and critically, social status explicitly, formally baked into the legal system itself. It feels also like moving from a fluid system to one set in stone.
Roman law really was a masterpiece of formalization, designed to govern this sprawling, deeply unequal empire. And nothing shows this more clearly than the dual penalty system.
The two tiers of justice.
Exactly. Formalized right across the empire by imperial edicts. This wasn't just, a judge having a bad day or favoring someone. The law itself created two distinct categories of people for punishment. The honestiors.
The more honorable ones, the elite.
Right. Senators, equestrians, local bigwigs, veteran soldiers, the upper crust, and then everyone else, the humiliors.
The lower ones, the vast majority.
The common folk. And the crucial point is, for the exact same crime, these two groups faced fundamentally different types of punishment. It was explicitly codified.
This codified inequality is just central to understanding Roman power, isn't it? So let's break it down. What happened to the honestiors if they committed a serious crime?
For the honestiors, the main goal of punishment wasn't usually physical destruction. It was political and social death. Execution, capite ponere, was incredibly rare for them, really only reserved for things like treason against the emperor.
So no crucifixion or being thrown to beasts for senators?
Generally, no. Their typical punishments were designed to strip them of their status and remove them from public life. Exile was common.
You mentioned different forms of exile before, relegatio and deportatio.
Yes, and the difference mattered hugely. Relegatio was the milder form. You'd be banished, maybe to an island or a specific province, perhaps for a set time or indefinitely. But crucially, you kept your Roman citizenship, you kept your property. Your legal status was largely intact, just relocated.
Okay. And deportatio.
That was far worse. Lifetime banishment, often to a really harsh remote place like an oasis or a barren rock. And it came with capitis deminutio maxim, the complete loss of Roman citizenship. Your property was confiscated by the state. You became, legally, a non-person.
Social death, literally. What else could they face?
They could be kicked out of the Senate that was motu ordained. They could be disqualified from holding any public office or face enormous fines that could cripple them financially. The punishment targeted their status, their public identity, their wealth, preserve the body, destroy the public man.
Right. Now contrast that with the humiliores, the commoners, the workers, the poor. What was their fate for serious crimes?
Brutally physical. They were the ones who faced the summum supplicium, the highest penalty, which meant the most extreme forms of execution. These were deliberately gruesome and public, intended as deterrence.
Like what?
Like crucifixion, a slow, agonizing, deeply humiliating death reserved for slaves and the lowest freeborn, burning alive, crematio or vivicumburium, being thrown to wild beasts in the arena, damnatio ad bestias. These were spectacles of terror.
And if they weren't executed?
Then often it was condemnation to lifelong hard labor. In the mines, damnatio ad metellum, basically a death sentence from exhaustion and abuse. Or on public works projects, damnatio and opus publicum. Again, conditions were usually horrific, survival rates were low.
The sheer brutality is staggering.
Yeah.
And this difference in treatment, I understand, it even extended to things like torture.
It did. Traditionally in the Republic, torture was used primarily on slaves to get testimony, as they weren't trusted to tell the truth otherwise. Free citizens were generally exempt.
But that changed.
It did, particularly in the imperial period, 2nd, 3rd centuries AD. The use of torture was formally extended in legal proceedings to humiliores freeborn commoners. They could be tortured for evidence or confession.
But not the anestiores.
Categorically not. They remained protected from torture. The distinction was absolute. It permeated every stage. Even before trial, anestiores usually had the privilege of avoiding jail. They could remain free, perhaps under surety, until the verdict.
While humiliores would likely be locked up immediately.
Far more likely, yes. Power and status were reflected in every single interaction with the legal system.
This rigid hierarchy brings us straight to a really fascinating group. The liberty. The freedmen and freedwomen. They weren't slaves, but they weren't quite at the top either. Where did they fit?
They occupied this huge, complex, and absolutely vital middle ground in Roman society. Freedmen were, in many ways, the engine of the Roman urban economy.
How so?
They were often the artisans, the shopkeepers, the traders, the administrators, the clerks. They filled the roles that the elite disdained and slayers couldn't hold independently. One writer even called them the most intelligent class of the community. They were crucial.
Providing something like a middle class.
The closest thing Rome had, yes. Their sheer numbers and economic importance meant their legal status was a constant preoccupation for Roman jurists and emperors.
But they were free.
Yeah.
Yet, you said not equal to someone born free and ingenious.
Sure.
What was the difference?
The core legal principle was simple. All men are either free or slaves. Okay. But the moment a slave was freed, manumitted, they didn't just become generically free, they entered this specific, legally defined liminal state.
A kind of halfway house.
In a way, there were actually different legal grades of freedman status depending on how they were freed and other factors. The top tier was becoming a sulilis Romanus libertus, a freedman with full Roman citizenship. Below that, you might be a Latinus Unionis, which came with Latin rights, a sort of intermediate status, often with restrictions on things like making a will or inheriting property fully. And at the bottom were the Peregrini Deditici, a very low status, almost like surrendered enemies with very few rights.
But even for the ones who got full Roman citizenship,
Yeah.
there was still a catch, wasn't there? The connection to their former master.
Ah, yes, the shadow of the patronus. That's the absolute key legal difference between a freed person, libertus or liberta, and a freeborn person, ingenuus. The act of manumission didn't sever the tie completely, it transformed it.
Into what?
Into a legal relationship called patronage. The freed person owed certain duties, called obsequium, to their former master, the patronus. This could include showing respect, performing certain services, operate, and importantly, it affected inheritance.
And this bond, it wasn't just personal, it passed down.
It passed down through the patron's male line, so the patron's son and his son would inherit the rights of patronage over the freedmen and potentially their descendants. It was an enduring legal connection. Their freedom was, in a sense, conditional and relational.
They were citizens maybe, but citizens with an asterisk.
Yeah.
A legal supervisor hovering over them.
That's a good way to put it. And this patronal power really hit home in areas like property and inheritance, especially for freed women.
How did it affect them?
It created real succession problems. Imagine a freed woman. She might marry, have her own children, but if she died intestate without leaving a valid will, the ancient law of the 12 Tables still had provisions giving inheritance rights to the patronus or patrona, female patron. These rights could potentially trump the rights of the freed woman's own children to inherit her property.
Wait, the former master could inherit instead of the freed woman's own kids.
Under certain circumstances, particularly defined by the older laws, yes. The system prioritized the continuation of the patronal family's interest in the property that originated, ultimately, from their household. Later laws modified this, especially if the patrona had children of her own. Her rights were often strengthened then. It was complex, but the underlying point is clear. The paternal tie could override even the natural bonds of motherhood in the eyes of the law.
A very tangible reminder that freedom didn't automatically mean full autonomy, especially over your own property and legacy.
Exactly. Status mattered, even after manumission.
Okay, so Rome wasn't just about rigid status and harsh penalties. It was also this incredible engine of, Well, legal ingenuity, particularly for managing trade and commerce across this vast empire.
Absolutely. They had to be pragmatic. And you see this nowhere better, perhaps, than in that ancient, incredibly durable form of contract, the stipulatio.
The verbal contract, this sounds so simple, just words.
Deceptively simple. Its longevity is just astonishing. It was a cornerstone for creating legally binding obligations right from the early Republic all the way through Justinian's codification in the 6th century AD. It survived for centuries.
So what was the mechanism? How did it actually work? You mentioned it had a psychological element.
It was pure psychological design, really clever. The stipulatio required this very strict, formal question and answer format. It had to be symmetrical.
Symmetrical how?
The person receiving the promise, the stipulator, had to phrase the terms as a direct question, using a specific formal verb like sponder to promise solemnly. So they'd ask, spondesne, do you promise, to pay me 10,000 sesterces by the 1st of next month?
Okay, a formal question.
And the person making the promise, the promiser, had to reply immediately, using the exact same verb in the first person. Bondeo, I promise. They couldn't just say yes or okay or I will. It had to be the mirror image. Do you promise? I promise.
That feels quite unnatural. Why enforce such a rigid, almost artificial way of talking?
That was the genius of it. Think about normal conversation. How easily do we say, yeah, sure, or not along without maybe fully registering the commitment? We just glide over things.
Right.
The stipulatio's awkward formal structure acted as a deliberate break in that flow. It forced a pause. It was designed, as one scholar put it, to break the tenor of the conversation and stop the promiser from just gliding over a dangerous pledge.
It made you stop and think, okay, I am formally promising this now.
Precisely. It ensured conscious awareness and consent. In a world where many transactions were oral and maybe written evidence wasn't easy to get or rely on, this formal psychological check was an incredibly smart way and expediency to make sure both sides understood the legal bond they were creating. Very ingenious.
That foresight, that pragmatism, also shows up in how they regulated certain essential businesses, right?
Yeah.
Imposing special rules on people like shipmasters and innkeepers.
Yes. The Praetor's Edict carved out special liability rules for exercitors. This covered shipmasters, natae, innkeepers, capones, and stable keepers, stabulari. Basically, anyone providing essential transport or lodging services.
And what was the special rule?
It was a form of strict liability. The Praetor declared that these service providers were automatically liable for any damage or loss to goods that customers entrusted to their pair, septum.
Automatically liable, even if it wasn't their fault.
Generally, yes. Even if they could argue they weren't negligent. If you checked your luggage into an inn and it disappeared, the innkeeper was liable, period. Unless
what? There had to be some exception.
Unless the loss was caused by an unavoidable accident, what the Romans called vis major superior force.
Example.
Things genuinely outside human control. A shipwreck in a storm, an attack by pirates, a sudden earthquake, an enemy invasion, acts of God or war, essentially. But if your goods were simply stolen from the inn or damaged by careless staff, the innkeeper paid.
Why single out these professions for such a tough rule? Standard contract law usually required proving fault, right?
It did. Standard locatio conductio, hire contracts, required proof of negligence or malice. But the Praetor introduced this stricter rule, as the sources say, explicitly as a public measure. He wanted to make known to those engaged in these occupations that he was taking care to repress dishonesty.
So it was about deterring theft and carelessness in vital industries.
Exactly. These were choke points in the empire's commerce and travel. People had to use ships, inns, stables. The potential for collusion between, say, an innkeeper and local thieves or just plain negligence was high and often hard for a traveler to prove after the fact.
Right.
By imposing strict liability, the Praetor basically forced these providers to take maximum care, almost act as insurers for the goods they accepted. It was about maintaining public trust in the infrastructure of the empire.
Again, incredibly pragmatic, and that pragmatism, it seems, extended even to situations involving debt, trying to avoid completely ruining someone.
Yes, Roman jurists showed a practical streak there too. They recognized the validity of pacts, agreements, where a creditor agrees with their debtor to only sue them to the extent that the debtor can actually pay, in id quod facere potest.
So you wouldn't take their last penny?
Essentially, yes. It wasn't necessarily seen as charity, but as a reasonable modification of the debt obligation. The jurists upheld these agreements, arguing it prevented debtors from being utterly ruined, potentially becoming destitute and a burden on society. Better to recover something than push someone into absolute poverty.
Practicality over strict adherence to the letter of the debt. And that focus on underlying reality, on intent, also seems key in how they define personal injury or insult in Uria.
Intent, the animus injuriandi, the intention to inflict insult, was absolutely paramount for inuria. It wasn't just about the words spoken or the physical act. It was about the deliberate aim to affront someone's dignity and honor.
And this could get quite subtle.
Very subtle. There's a fascinating example involving creditors and debtors. A debtor could actually bring an action for inuria against his creditor, not for insulting him directly, but if the creditor deliberately harassed the debtor's guarantors.
Harassing the people who back the loan, how is that an insult to the main debtor?
Because the creditor's purpose in harassing the guarantors might be purely to indirectly affront and put pressure on the principal debtor himself, to shame him, damage his network, undermine his standing by attacking his supporters.
So the insult isn't the harassment of the guarantors per se, but the intent behind it, to degrade the debtor.
Precisely. The law looked through the action to the underlying intent to injure the debtor's honor and reputation. In a status-conscious society, attacking someone's network to deliberately shame them was seen as a direct, actionable insult against the principal person. Intent was everything.
Okay, let's wrap up with maybe the most intellectually sophisticated part of Roman law. This constant internal discussion, almost a tension between different kinds of law, specifically ius gentium and ius naturali.
Right. This is where Roman jurists really start to sound like philosophers. They were constantly trying to categorize law. Ius gentium they saw as the law of nations. Those customs, rules, and institutions that seemed to be observed by, well, basically all peoples they knew. Universal custom.
Things
like basic trade practices, rules about ambassadors, warfare conventions, and crucially, institutions like slavery.
And that's the ius naturale, natural law.
That was law derived from natural reason. What philosophy, what inherent logic about the world and human nature dictates should be right and just.
And initially they thought these were the same thing, or closely related.
Often, yes. There was a strong tendency, especially in earlier periods, to equate ius gentium with ius naturale. The thinking was sort of, if everyone does it, it must be natural, it must be reasonable. Universal custom reflects underlying natural reason.
They hit a snag, a really big one.
They hit a massive, unavoidable contradiction, and it stared them right in the face every day.
Slavery.
Slavery. It was undeniably aeris gentium. Every society they knew practiced it in some form. It was a universal custom, a pillar of the economy, no question.
But when they thought about it purely through reason, through ius naturale,
Especially the great jurists writing in the High Empire, the age of the Antonines, a period often seen as more enlightened. They admitted it didn't square. They stated quite clearly that while slavery existed by the aeris gentium, by ius naturale, all men are born free. Philosophy, natural reason, offered no justification for enslaving another human being.
Wow. So the most advanced legal minds of the Roman world were explicitly acknowledging that a fundamental institution of their society, sanctioned by universal custom, ius gentium, was directly contrary to what natural reason, ius naturale, told them was right.
Exactly. They saw the gap. They documented this profound tension between the law as it was, shaped by custom and expediency and power, and the law as perhaps it ought to be, according to ideal moral reason. They didn't overthrow slavery because of it. The practicalities were too entrenched. But they recognized the contradiction.
That internal critique, the self-awareness of the gap between positive law and natural justice is really quite remarkable.
It is. It shows a level of intellectual honesty that's pretty compelling, even now. Hashtag tag outrozo.
So wrapping up this deep dive, it feels like we've seen two incredibly powerful, yet very different systems of social engineering, really.
Masterful systems in their own ways, albeit often brutal ways.
In Athens, law was so deeply intertwined with politics, with that personal agonistic struggle for honor. Trials were stages, vengeance was a driving force. Truth seemed almost secondary sometimes to winning the argument, maintaining your standing.
Right. And then in Rome, you see the shift towards formalism, hierarchy, standardization across a vast empire. Law becomes this intricate machine for managing status, pragmatic enough to create brilliant commercial tools like the stipulatio, yet ruthlessly rigid in how it punished. Your status literally determined whether you kept your property and went into exile or faced the beasts in the arena. In both systems, rights and consequences were explicitly, inescapably tied to who you were in the social hierarchy.
And that fundamental tension we kept coming back to. It seems the ancient jurists themselves were wrestling with it, especially in Rome, this gap they saw.
That gap between what the law actually was rooted in custom, tradition, universal practice, the imus gentium and what they perceived the law ought to be based on ideal reason, imus naturale.
They saw it was slavery, most starkly. They didn't bridge the gap, but they were aware of it. They wrote about it.
And that awareness, that persistence of the tension between the imus and the ought in law is maybe what makes digging into ancient law so relevant. It's like a shortcut to understanding how power works, even today.
So the final thought, perhaps, for you listening.
Yeah, the challenge it leaves us with is where in our own legal systems, our own societies, whether it's formally in the law books or just deeply embedded in social custom, do we still knowingly enforce structures, conventions, ways of doing things that we suspect or even know run counter to what universal reason or fundamental justice suggests?
Where does our modern imus gentium clash with our imus natural?
Exactly. Recognizing that gap, that tension, it didn't start with us, and it certainly hasn't ended. It's a fundamental aspect of law and power that we're still grappling with.
A very compelling and maybe, as you say, slightly uncomfortable question to leave things on. Thank you. This has been a fascinating journey.
It has indeed. Until next time.